So like I said before, I hope that you guys have had a chance to read this. We're going to try to finish up the chapter on the argument from morality. That's chapter 6. Okay. Have you guys read it at home? Or you're not at home, but at camp? Have any of you guys gotten through this?
No, I didn't bring my book. I was gonna bring my book, but then I forgot it at home.
All right. So and again, the other thing is we haven't put the classes up on their YouTube page, but hopefully we will get those up in very near future. All right. So we're quite a bit backlogged, but hopefully we'll get them up and on the internet so you guys can. So if you guys missed any, you can kind of catch up. All right. So the moral question, again, I said this last time, I think is the most practically relevant question that is addressed in this book in terms of like questions that you're going to end up hearing from people who are your friends when they ask you like, why do you believe this stuff? And you can kind of get into the Bible. And that's the question of like, what's good and bad, right and wrong. Because the prevailing opinion of most people today is that I get to decide for myself what's good, bad, right, and wrong. And we said that if you decide, that means, or if you can decide, if you have the ability to decide, and you're the one who ultimately gets to make your own rules, right? There's, Frank Sinatra, chairman of the board. No. Right.
Hey, little young, it's all good.
But he had a famous song called "I'll Do It My Way."
Yeah.
Right. Or there was a song from Billy Joel who said, "Go ahead with your own life, leave me alone." Right. That's what most people in the world today say. I can do what I want to do, and who are you to tell me? And we said that kind of morality has a name for it. You remember what the name we said it is? If you get to pick what's good, bad, right, or wrong.
Subjective.
Subjective. Right? What's the opposite of subjective? Objective, right? So if it's not up to you, that means it's objective. Okay. So those are the two categories that we talked about. Now there's other categories that we also talked about. So like I talked about 2 weeks ago, there's a even deeper question about what is good, bad, right, or wrong. There's a question of whether good, bad, right, or wrong even really exists at all. Remember that? And there's a fancy word for that one too. You remember what the fancy word for that is? It's a word that has to do with questions of existence, whether something actually exists. Because ultimately, I'll pull this up here. Remember we said that ultimately, if good, bad, right, or wrong is just subjective, my argument that I talked about last week is that if it's just your opinion or preference or belief, then ultimately what we said is that good, bad, right, or wrong don't really exist at all. In the same way that we talked about Peter Pan doesn't really exist at all. Or we talked about how there's no best flavor of ice cream that exists somewhere out in the universe waiting to be discovered by everybody else. Which again, I think if it was, it would probably be mint chocolate chip. No. All right. Oh, I'm sorry. For everybody at home, I got to share my screen. Hold on a minute. All right. So remember, if it's just subjective, then this is essentially what we're dealing with. And ultimately, if morality is subjective, then what we're saying is that good, bad, right, or wrong are really meaningless terms. You get them from, well, let me ask you guys, where do they come from?
Where does what come from?
Morality. Good, bad, right, or where does it come from if it's subjective?
It's your opinion.
It's just your opinion, but where do those opinions come from? And this is like
conscience?
from the non-Christian, non-objective point of view. If you're just asking your friends, okay, then
Yeah.
where do you get these ideas from?
So I heard an atheist by the name of Sam Harris. I was watching a debate this week. According to him, it comes from consciousness, and morality is based on human well-being, which is subjective still.
Right. So he
That was
says
kind of his answer.
human flourishing.
Human
That's
flourishing.
the words that
That's the word he
right?
uses,
Human
yeah.
flourishing. So, and so the question then is, why should we prefer human flourishing over the flourishing of any other kind of animal? That's one question to ask. There's some more questions to ask. We talked about this before.
Yeah,
Who decides what leads to human flourishing?
exactly.
Because take, for example, Hitler. Ultimately, what was Hitler trying to do?
Make a better human race.
Trying to make a better human race by getting rid of all the people he thought shouldn't be reproducing. And he makes that argument clear if you ever read his book that he wrote, Mein Kampf. He says essentially that you have to make a better human race. And you do that in the same way that Darwinian evolution says. You don't let the unfit people breed, right? You breed the best with the best. And the other people, if you just let them breed and don't kill them off like nature kills them off, then they're ultimately going to ruin it for everybody else. So ultimately, Hitler and the Holocaust, according to Hitler's opinion, was leading to human flourishing. Is that okay?
From a naturalistic viewpoint, I guess.
You can't say
You
it.
can't
You
say
can't
it,
say
yeah.
that it's wrong. Now, you know, if you want one history example of something terrible, the Holocaust is that example, right? Have you guys ever gone to the Holocaust Museum down in Washington, D.C.? Or you studied this in school, I assume, at some point, right? Yeah, I mean, if you ever get into looking at this, it's just terrible. What a terrible, terrible thing that they did. But you can't say it's wrong. So where do these ideas come from? Somebody else was, I think, was Josiah. Were you going to say something?
I said, I said morality comes from conscience, but I didn't say anything else after that.
Okay. Which we've talked about consciousness too. That doesn't solve the problem because where does consciousness come from?
Exactly.
Right. On a materialistic worldview, then you're just your brain.
It's your brain, the
So-
chemicals.
So it's not like you actually have any real thoughts. They just happen. It's like soda fizzing, right? You shake it up and the bubbles come out, right? That's what you're doing, right? You just, but ultimately, it would have to come from like we've evolved these. Because if you get rid of God, like what's left? You have to have like Frank Turek, the guy that I show you a lot of his videos. He talks about how did we get here? He says from goo to you via the zoo, right? So that's how we got here. We just magically just kind of kept getting more and more advanced until we just became conscious, and then all of a sudden we can think and determine truth and math and do all these crazy things that just happen to coincide with the way the universe really is. What an amazing coincidence, right? But there's nothing, if that's true, there's nothing that's like objectively real about morality. Does that make sense? Like if you were to go back and rewind the whole evolutionary thing again, if that's really what happened, which I don't think it is, then you could end up with a completely different set of moral values, right? So there doesn't seem to be anything about morality, like, or if you take it from societal points of view, like, let's just say there are social standards. But again, you could use the Nazis as an example. Like, that's the way that they wanted to do it in Germany. Live and let live, right? But that obviously is not true. That's not right. And so we said that ontologically, we know, and remember we talked about the test for truth. I said, can you live consistently without there being anything such as good, bad, right, or wrong? And we said that yes, okay, really, go back. There has to be a moral law because we know that behaviors are not just neutral. Like there are good behaviors and there are bad behaviors. Love is not the same as hating somebody. Violence is not the same as peace. Oppression is not the same as justice. Like all these behavioral type things, we know that they're all not the same. And so there must be some moral law, and we talked about this again 2 weeks ago, okay? And that all relates to salvation and whatnot. So that's where we got this moral law argument. So the moral law argument is here. This is the one that he talks about in the book. If God does not exist, then there are no objective moral values and duties. But our sense experience, we all have a moral sense, we all have a conscience. We know, and again, this is the interesting thing. When you talk to people who don't want to admit this, they'll say, well, I don't think that Hitler was a good guy, but who am I to say? Well, why don't you? Right?
Yeah.
Why don't you? Because if we measure things, like oftentimes we can act like we could live without good, bad, right, or wrong. But when good and bad, right or wrong, when things are done to you, then all of a sudden it's real, right? Like, you know, like that wasn't fair. That wasn't right. You shouldn't do that. Those types of things, right? We all have this sense like, hey, you've wronged me. That wasn't right. It's like, well, I thought good, bad, right, or wrong don't exist. So my argument is that they do exist. We can't, like, it fails the test of correspondence to say that they don't exist. And so since they do exist, therefore God exists, because if there's no God, there's no way to get good, bad, right, or wrong in the first place. Does this all make sense? This is a little complicated, but if you, like, once you get this wrapped around, like once you get it, it's such a powerful argument.
It's pretty mind-blowing.
It's mind-blowing because
It really is.
and one of the things, the next chapter, which I'd like you to read if you can before next week, but the next chapter is going to talk about evil and suffering. And so a lot of times people will say, well, how can there be God if there's evil and suffering in the world? Which is interesting, because if there's no God, then there is no evil and suffering in the world. It just is. So the argument for evil, to say that evil exists, is only possible if there's God, right? So you can't, like, you're not helping yourself out there if you take that approach. All right, so any comments from anybody? I want to show you another video. I like these videos. But and part of why I want to show this one is I've shown this guy before, and there's two reasons. One, because in the next chapter, he talks about this debate that he has with Lewis Wolpert, and Lewis Wolpert says there's no evidence for God's existence, and Craig says there is evidence for God's existence, and here it is. And then Wolpert says there's no evidence for God's existence, and Craig says there is evidence for God's existence, and here it is. And Wolpert says there's no evidence for God's existence. So this is Wolpert, right? This is the guy that he's talking about at the beginning of the next chapter, but they're talking about morality. And so again, this is a very famous philosopher. So you think that these guys they all have their doctoral degrees and they're very highly educated. So you think that they would get it, but when you watch this, it's clear that they don't get it. It's like, you're like, and then you'll see Craig, he's very gracious and very patient, but he's like, you're not understanding my argument here, right? Okay, so let me show you this. I can pull this up without popping that screen down. No.
Go over by the YouTube.
Good night. I just want to open a tab, please. Oh, that's not the right one. There it is. Right.
Argument is not that belief in God is necessary in order to do good or live a moral life or be a decent chap. The argument has nothing to do about belief in God. The argument is that without God, there isn't any absolute standard of right and wrong. And therefore, what we call moral values are just the spin-offs of socio-biological evolution. Altruism, like you mentioned, self-sacrificial behavior, a mother rushing into a burning building.
No, specifically not a mother to save a child, because there's a perfectly good reason for a mother saving
Well,
a child.
but if you say that, see, then again, you're still misunderstanding my argument. What I was going to say is that on the sociobiological point of view, that kind of altruistic behavior is just a selfish gene wanting to perpetuate itself. And it's the same kind of behavior you see in a troop of baboons, where you see what looks like altruistic behavior, or even in an ant heap, where fighter ants will sacrifice themselves.
Do you know what altruism means? Altruism means self-sacrificial behavior. So I don't do it for selfish reasons. I do it for the benefit of someone else, right? So in other words, he's saying, like, you see these behaviors in nature where some animal does something that's not in its own best interest. And you say, well, that's good and that animal must have some moral reason for doing it. But what he's saying is that's just the way they're programmed to do. Like, or you could make some evolutionary argument that you're just doing it because you want to keep your population alive. Like you want to keep your children alive, or keep, there's some evolutionary advantage to doing something that wouldn't be necessarily in your best interest. But he's saying, like, that doesn't do anything to show that it's really good. It just shows that it has some kind of evolutionary advantage to it.
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess.
For the good of the heap. My point is that on the atheistic view, that's all moral values are.
Is that right? Let's clear
And
that up.
I would like to
Is
ask,
there any difference? Let me come back in 1 second.
The guy in the
Just
right
ask
is
Lewis
Lewis.
whether there is any difference between the altruistic behavior of a human being. Somebody may sacrifice him or herself for a cause which will bring them no particular benefit, and a baboon.
Well, there are occasions where there are groups of animals where there's someone who will scream when danger comes. Therefore, the thing. So these can be biologically determined, but also there's the whole complex of the nature of the sociology of the society and how different societies behave, and that's got nothing to do with God. That's complex sociology and biology.
so that's
And who
exactly what I
imposed
said.
the complex biology? Where did that come from?
Evolution.
Right.
We're back to the old.
No, see, that's my argument. That is all that moral values are on atheism. And that therefore, as I say, rape, child abuse, these may be socially inconvenient, or
As
taboo.
an
But
atheist, I'm not a rapist.
you're misunderstanding my argument. Of course you're not. You're misunderstanding the argument. I'm not arguing that to be a good person, you have to believe in God. What I'm arguing is that without God, there is no absolute moral values, no absolute moral duties. We are like advanced primates, and what we call moral values are just these ingrained sociobiological patterns.
Yes, that's exactly what they are.
Okay, so that is your view. I was not sure of that. Well, then you see, when you make these moral judgments yourself, you're acting inconsistently with your own worldview. When you make moral judgments like everyone has the right to believe whatever he wants so long as it doesn't interfere with others. Where's this notion of rights suddenly come from? That's just
History and sociology.
right, just sociologically ingrained
Yes.
behavior. So the pedophile or the rapist or the psychopath or the person who wants to be a religiously intolerant persecutor is just acting out of fashion. He's like the person who dashes a meal.
No, Hitler wasn't acting out of fashion. He acted in his particular way, which other people objected to. Of
Right, but there wasn't anything morally wrong with what he did, right, on your view?
course there was.
It was just contrary to the patterns of sociobiological behavior that have been ingrained in the human species, not to kill each other off. Why was what he did objectively wrong?
Because it killed many people and made people extremely unhappy.
All right, but now that goes on all the time in the animal kingdom, right?
No,
Killing other animals.
no, it does not.
Well, when a lion kills a zebra,
Oh, well, a lion kills a zebra.
Because it
So
isn't.
what about when you kill your turkey? Be careful with turkeys with Americans.
yes. Well, fine, use that example. On atheism, these are all morally neutral acts because there isn't any standard of right and wrong.
Sure, there isn't.
Okay, so.
Right. See that?
My argument is not,
So again, you know what I mean? Like you're left with, like there is no objective morality. But again, that goes back to the parable of the madman that we read. Remember that? You guys weren't here, but Friedrich Nietzsche wrote a parable called The Parable of the Madman, where this guy comes in the morning and he's in the marketplace and he says, I seek God, I seek God. And then the people that are there start laughing at him. They're like, ooh, where did God go? Did he run away? Did he immigrate? Did he go somewhere? And the madman says, he throws his lantern down the ground and he says, I'll tell you where God is. He's dead and we've killed him. And then he starts talking about all the consequences of not having a God. And by the time he ends up, they're all just standing there looking at him in astonishment. And he says, I've come too early. This deed, though done by men, hasn't arrived yet. And he talks about how light from stars require time and thunder requires time from the lightning. And he said, this deed is still further off than the most distant stars, even though it's done by them. And then, so we talked about, well, what in the world was he talking about? Because Nietzsche hated Christianity. He hated it, right? What was he talking about? He's saying that people don't believe in God, but yet they act as if God does exist and all the things that you need to have God for still exist. Like, so in other words, if you want to be consistent in your thinking, then you can't talk, if you don't believe in God, then you can't talk about morality. You can't talk about rights. Like you just said, I mean, you don't have any rights. The only reason you have any rights is because the government gives you the rights. And if the government can give you the rights, the government can take them away too. There's no such thing as justice or equality or fairness. Where do you find that in the natural world? And so his point was that, and again, Hitler was a big fan of Nietzsche and read Nietzsche, and thought, yes, we'll make up our own morals and do our own thing, right? So like, that's the point that he's making. Does this all make sense? All right, let me show you one more quick video and then I want to just hear your thoughts and then we'll kind of wrap up this topic. This is one more of those Frank Turek videos. I like these because I like the interaction. Maybe. Because most people, I think you'll find when you talk to most people, and even like that guy, they haven't thought about any of this stuff, right? No one that I've talked to that like has really ever spent any real amount of time thinking about this stuff. Because when you talk to them about it, they're just kind of like, and even for me, when I first discovered all this stuff, it takes a while. You have to kind of like go through it. And that's why I've spent the last few weeks doing this, and I keep going through it. Because you hear it once, it's like math class. You hear it once and the teacher explains the math problem and you're like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. And then you go home and you try to do the same problem and you're like, wait, what just happened? Right? How did they do that? I don't remember how to do that. So then you go back and you ask the question, you're like, can you do number 16? And the teacher's like, sure. And they do it and you watch it and you're like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. And then you go to do it again and you're just like, wait, what, like, okay, what do you do after that? So this is the same type of thing. You really have to go, you have to kind of think through it, and eventually it clicks. And once it clicks, then it's very powerful. Okay, so this kid is a prime example. A lot of the things that this guy says, clearly he hasn't thought about a lot. Right? So I say that in the nicest way I can.
I'm an atheist. Of course. I love hearing these kind of debates. You asked, why would you be an atheist if you possibly might know if God exists? My answer to that question is simple. It's just the fact that there's so many terrible things in the Bible. At one point, Jesus says to one of his disciples, "It's great that they're torturing their slaves, but only lightly. Even though they did nothing wrong, it's great that they're doing it." He doesn't give any reason to why he says that he doesn't do anything. I don't understand why you want to.
Can you guys at home see the screen?
No.
No,
Nope.
I can't.
You gotta tell me this stuff.
Yeah.
I think it stopped sharing. Yeah, it stopped sharing.
It just automatically just does that, just stops.
I don't know.
Did you see the last video?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
We'll rewind it.
I love hearing these kinds of debates and stuff. You asked, why would you be an atheist if you possibly might know if God exists? My answer to that question is simple. It's just the fact that there's so many terrible things in the Bible. Like, at one point, Jesus says to one of his disciples, "It's great that they're torturing their slaves, but only lightly. Even though they did nothing wrong, it's great that they're doing it." He doesn't give any reason to why he says that he doesn't do anything. I don't understand why you would want to follow such a God. My question to you is why you would follow such a God.
Okay, let's not even look at the context of that passage. Let's just assume what you said is 100% true. Okay. As an atheist, why is that wrong?
Why is that wrong?
Yeah.
Morally, I would think that each and every human being is the same. We all have the same rights. We all have the same wants and needs. I think we all should be the same. Especially the God that we should follow should have higher expectations of our no.
Okay, but you seem to be assuming that certain things are really right and people have certain rights, even if there is no God. How do you justify that? What's your standard of rightness?
My standard of rightness would be a fair society.
What do you mean by fair?
Fair. Everything is equal. I personally, I have nothing wrong. I find nothing wrong in a communist state. That's just my opinion. I don't think it's something you can be afraid of. Everybody seems to be afraid of it.
Okay.
In the United States, at least. But that's just my thought of fairness, is the idea that all humans should be the same. We all
Okay, so it's your thought of fairness. What if Hitler has a different idea of fairness? Is he wrong?
He's not wrong. He is.
Hitler's not wrong.
He is not, well, in a kind of idea that we all have our own opinions. I feel like we should take the utilitarian view and go with what is best for the most amount of us.
Okay, but what do you mean by best?
What would be the greatest positives for the most amount of people?
Okay, but you're assuming that you're assuming there's a best out there. You're assuming a moral law. Where does that moral law come from if there's no God?
I personally just think that human beings should be able to make up their own laws. I mean, each people in time have found their own moral laws, and I think they become better and better over time.
Better, but you wouldn't even know what better was unless you knew what best was. I'm asking you, what is your standard of best to say that certain people are closer to the best or better than others? What's the standard? Is it just your opinion, or is there something beyond your opinion which says this is good?
Well, I mean, we've all heard about utopias and a perfect society and things like that. That would be great in a way, but also we've all seen like books like Huxley's, I believe, I forget what it's called. But he makes a book on
Great for the world? Yes.
It's that perfect society where everything's perfect. There's no murder, there's no.
Okay, but the question is, and maybe I'm just not stating it properly, what's wrong with murder if there's no God? Why shouldn't I kill other people to get what I want if there's no God?
Because it doesn't help society.
But why do I care about society?
Because we as a group shouldn't worry about society. We should be making the betterment of ourselves.
But Kyle, you're importing a moral law into a frame that has no moral law. As an atheist, you're trying to say there is no God, which means there is no standard of rightness out there. But I'm saying this is my personal standard of rightness, which would mean somebody else could come along like Hitler or Stalin and say, Kyle, if there's no standard beyond neither you or me, then I can do whatever I want, including killing you to get what you have.
That's a very good point. It's a very good point. I can see where you're coming from. I don't think that God is needed in a sense I'm not looking for perfection. I don't think anybody here is. I'm not looking for that. I'm looking for human beings just to simply work together to better society. I don't really see that need for a perfect identity up above.
Okay, I mean, I'm not saying that an atheist can't be a good person. I'm not saying atheists don't know right from wrong. That's not my point. My point is that it seems to me it's difficult to justify what rightness is if everything is reduced to human opinion. Which human gets to decide, right? It's subjective then, as Levi was saying before, it's just in my subjective mind. If there's not an external reference to say that this is good and this is evil, then we're all just here and we're fending for ourselves. Now, a lot of people will say, and I appreciate your question, it's a very good question. A lot of people will say, well, we need to cooperate to get along, right? Actually, that's not true. Take somebody like Stalin. He cooperated with very few people, just his henchmen, and he killed 20 million people to get what he wanted. And then he died on his deathbed at the age of 74, shaking his fist at God one last time. He never paid for his sins on this life. Okay? So the problem, it seems to me, is we know, and you know right, you know what's right and wrong, and I know it too, and I don't need to believe in God to know that. I just need there to be a God to justify it. Let me put it this way. A lot of atheists say, look, I know right from wrong, and I agree with you, know right from wrong. But that's like saying, I can know what a book says and deny there's an author, which is true. But there would be no book to read unless there was an author. The same is true when it comes to morality. You can know what the right thing to do is and deny there's a God. But there would be no right thing to do unless there was a God. Does that make sense? Yes, it's. Let me, if I gave you a book, would you read it? Yes. Okay, good. Before we go, where's Emma? She's back there somewhere. She'll be at the book table. Let me meet you at the book table and give you a book. Thank you so much.
All right, so. Stop the share now. All right, so thoughts. I've done a lot of talking last few weeks. What do you got? And really, this is it. If you watch any of William Lane Craig's debates, he changes it up sometimes.
Yeah.
But many, many times he goes in with 5 arguments for the existence of God, and these are the 5 arguments that we've covered so far. So you have, can we review? The first argument is what?
Oh, the premises?
Well, he talks about the Kalam cosmological argument.
Yeah.
Do you know that argument? Whatever begins to exist. And again, I'm telling you, like literally,
Whatever
when I
begins to exist
first
has a
came up with
cause.
this stuff, I didn't come up with it, when I first got was aware of these things. I literally have them in my Bible. So
Oh, wow.
if I'm talking, like I know them now, right? But that's what I want you to do. I want you to put it in here, because just like thy word have I hid in my heart that I might not sin against thee, right? I memorized all this stuff when I was a kid, and that's why it's all in the King James Version. So most of the stuff I know from the Bible is in the King James Version. Same thing with this. You got to put it in your head so that it's there. So when you're at school and you're talking to your friends, and they're like kind of, we did that atheist thing at the beginning, the first class. I don't know if any of you guys are here, right? So if you go online and watch the very first class, that's what we did. So I pretended that I was an atheist and we were talking about this stuff, and I was like, convince me that there's a God. So right off the bat, I have these arguments that I can use. So that's what he uses. So the first one is anything that begins to exist as a cause, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And there's the argument from contingency. Anything that begins to exist, anything that exists has a cause of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or an external cause. The universe began to exist. Well, if the universe has a cause, the cause is God. The universe began to exist, therefore the cause of the universe is God. Right? That's the argument from contingency. There's the ontological argument that has to do with if it's possible for a maximally great being to exist, then a maximally great being would exist. That there's more to the argument. It's that if it's possible, then he would exist in some possible world. If a maximally great being exists, then he would exist in every possible world. Therefore, an actually great being exists in the actual world. Therefore, an actual maximally great being exists. Right? Then we talked about the argument from design. Fine-tuning of the universe is due to either
Necessity, chance, or design.
yes,
Yeah.
or fine-tuning, right? And it's not due to chance or necessity, so therefore it's due. And then we talked about the moral argument. If objective moral values and duties exist,
And God exists.
then God exists. Moral objective values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. Those are the 5. So comments, I'd like to hear any, we have 5 minutes. Or questions about anything that we've talked about. I have one more clip that I could show you, but I'd rather hear you guys.
I think it was cool how we saw in that last video how the guy who was talking on the other end, he changed what he was saying by the end. Like he started saying one thing and by the end he was saying something completely different just to counteract what the guy was saying. That just goes to show how wrong his argument was.
Or again, and even the other guy, what I'm telling you from my experience in talking to people about this stuff is that most people haven't really thought about this stuff. They think they know, but they haven't really thought about it. And when you have to kind of walk them through, okay, and step by step, like if this is true, then this must be the case, right? And they're like, okay, right, okay. And then if that's true, then this must be the case, right? And they're like, okay, right? And then you kind of get to the conclusion, but they don't like the conclusion. And so then they try to like figure out like, wait, that can't be right? But mentally, even like the guy said, like, wow, what are you talking about? You know, but by the end of it, he's like, well, there are no standards. Yes, exactly. So you're just contradicted your whole argument. And even that's hard to get people to see. But the point is, and that's why I said in the beginning of the next chapter, he talks about that same guy's like, you haven't given me any reasons to believe that God exists. And he's like, I just gave you 5. He's like, well, you haven't given me any reasons. He's like, well, I just gave you 5. You know? So which argument do you guys like the best?
Ooh. It's got to be between the ontological and the kalam. But yeah.
I like the kalam.
Yeah.
I think those are the 2.
I think the moral argument is pretty good because it's pretty simple.
Yeah.
So now, like again, where do these arguments get us to?
The existence of God.
Right, but that's pretty vanilla, isn't it? I mean, there's not a lot of, it's very plain. In other words, it's not, doesn't give you to Jesus as Lord, so you need to put your faith and trust in him.
Yeah.
It just gets us that there's a God. Right? So these arguments would work for, if you were Jewish, they would work for you. And even if you're Muslim, they would work for you. So this is just, remember at the very beginning, we talked about that there's ultimately, you could take all the religious beliefs and put them into 3 categories. God made all, God is all, and no God at all. So we have, these arguments are to show that God made all. So at least we got that. So now there's only 3 monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So we've immediately narrowed it down. These are the only 3 that stand up to these arguments, right? That these arguments would, because again, a lot of these arguments, they're deductive arguments, and some of them are based on, we talked about philosophical reasons, there's scientific reasons that lead us to these conclusions, right? Like, so the Kalam argument, we talked about there's scientific evidence to show that the universe can't be past time infinite, but there's also philosophical evidence, right? You can't have an actually infinite number of things. I can't count down from infinity to get to today because there's no when does that start? There's no beginning. It just goes back forever and ever. So if we're here today, there must have been a beginning, right? So, and all these lead us to the point where there must be a God, okay? And then even that, like, what must that God be like? The Kalam tells us a lot about that too, right? He has to be timeless, without creation. He has to be spaceless, immaterial, personal,
It was like spaces, time.
immensely powerful.
All knowing.
The ontological argument tells us that God is maximally great. So that means, think about all the great making characteristics that you can. Is it greater to love someone or hate them? Is it better to be good or evil? Is it better to know stuff or to be ignorant? And you can apply all that stuff to God, right? Does it get better to be one place or to be in every place? So in all those things, God would be maximally great, right? He knows everything. He's all powerful. He's present everywhere. He is love. He is goodness. Like, think about that. What is good?
Good as God.
Good is to be like God.
Yeah.
So the closer you are to being like God, the better you are. And to be perfectly good is to be God.
Yeah.
See how all that stuff works?
It's mind blowing.
Yeah. All right. Anything else? Comments? Questions?
I just think it's funny how all these atheists try to come in and they're gonna debunk Christianity, and they're so like shocked at the simplicity of the arguments, and it just like debunks their whole argument so quickly they don't even know what to do or say.
Well, and so I really would like you to read chapter 7, because he talks about how they try to redefine atheism, not as a positive stance, because again, it's impossible to make a universal negation of God, to say that I know that there is no God. Like, you can't know that, right? So they realize that. So they'll say, like, well, atheism isn't a positive statement, which really it is. By definition, to say you're an atheist is to say that there is no God. But they'll say, like, atheism is just, I lack a belief in God. But that makes everybody, that's what he talks about. Then everybody is, the default position of everybody is an atheist. That's not true either. Right? So, like, you would be agnostic and just say, like, I'm ignorant, I don't know. But even that, the Bible would say, no, like, you have good reasons through creation, which we've talked about, to know that this just didn't happen. That there's got to be, like, if you have a book, there must be an author, right? There's got to be something else going on. All right, so make sure if you at all possible, at least read the beginning of the next chapter by next week. It will make this more interesting. Okay. So far, so good. Oh, the other thing too, like with what you said, Noah, I was thinking as an encouragement. I mean, I think it's helpful to know that, like, all the responses and like challenges, these aren't new, right? It's not like we're the first people to hear these things. They've been around a long time. And so again, there are answers to these things, because this hasn't gone away. Right? A lot of people have been saying, oh, Christianity will be done. We'll get rid of that. Like,
They're just all variations of the same argument.
right. And again, the Bible keeps coming through time after time after time. Like, oh, wow. It said that there was a beginning. Whew. Go figure, right? It says that God is love. It says that there's a good, bad, right, or wrong. Like, all these things, it just happens to be right. Like, so. All right. Let's close with the word of prayer. Lord, we just thank you for this time to think about these things. Thank you again that you love us. Thank you that you are the truth, and that you told us that your word is truth, and that you want us to be able to know you and to know the truth, and to be able to show your love to the people who we come into contact with. So we pray that you would equip us to do that and help us to be sure of these things and to be able to share them with people who we care about. We just thank you again for this food that you've prepared for us, and pray that you bless to our bodies. In Jesus' name we pray.